Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences as well as its faculty and students. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Saddiq Dzukogi, an assistant professor in the Department of English. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm happy to have you on and talk about all of your work and accomplishments. But first, I was hoping you could just introduce yourself, talk about your professional experience and how you came to Mississippi State.
Yeah, well, I am a poet and a writer. I came to the state in 2018 for a PhD in creative writing. I graduated in August, and I've been at Mississippi State for 2 months now. It's been exciting. I love the food, the culture, and there's just a lot to see here. It feels like there is this palpable energy in the air that is speaking to me and trying to nourish my creative side.
That is so great to hear. Seems like a long journey making it here, but we're so happy to have you, and I'm glad that you feel like you can plug in. And you're a poet, you joined the Department of English, and you just published a new collection of poems, Your Crib, My Qibla, which I understand is a very personal piece. You're writing about the grief of losing your daughter. So could you talk about that for a bit and what it was like to channel that grief into your writing?
Yeah, so in 2017, actually 6 months before we arrived the state, we lost our daughter, Bahara, and I was still working as a development worker in another city, which was about 400 kilometers away, so I wasn't physically present when she passed. And the moment that I heard of her passing, I had a pen, and there was a piece of paper on my desk, and I started writing. I remember the first few words that I wrote was, "There, sweet, sweet child." And for a very long time, I have always resorted to poetry to find understanding when things become blurry. When I do not understand anything, I resort to the silence of the page. It allows me an intimate moment to understand the emotion. So it was a good tool at that particular time. And the thing that death does is actually to instill absence. But on the page, I was able to rebel against that and continue to have a conversation with my daughter that passed.
That's so great to hear. In a lot of ways, I think that's what art is all about, is the self-expression and trying to find those answers. But sometimes, that's why it's so hard too, because how do you feel? So I'm so, glad to hear that you could turn it into art. It's such a hard thing to do. And the collection has recently garnered a lot of success. You were put on the short list for the Nigerian Prize for Literature, and just earlier this month, you were announced the winner of the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry. So such great accolades. What was it like to be given those awards for such a personal piece?
Those are the things that I call the extra of writing, because at the moment, and not just for the book, each time that I am writing, I just want to articulate, my understanding of my world, and also my lack of understanding of my world. But for this personal book, it was a struggle, because I am vulnerable in a way that I have never been, and it took a while before I even began to publish the poems in individual journals. It's a way, the book exists to perpetuate, the existence of my daughter, and I just wanted, people to hear about her. And the thing that the prizes do is that, it gives it a larger platform, to be heard. And so in that way, I feel very fortunate that it's continued to garner validation across the literary landscape, not just in America, but also in my home country, because that's particularly important to me, that, you know, like the people that I'm from are also engaging with my work and, you know, like finding it worthy of that engagement. And I'm just grateful. You know, sometimes I say I rather still continue to hold on to my daughter, but then this is the book and this is the only manifestation of her in the world. And I'm incredibly grateful for having such opportunity.
Sure, yeah, you know, like what you're saying, the awards are just that external validation, but maybe it's really just knowing that other people are reading it and connecting to it, getting to know your daughter and remember her. So that's just so great, and I think maybe it's the vulnerability that makes it stand out so much. So I'm glad that it has been recognized. I'm sure it's worthy of that. And you know, as people get the book and start to read it, what lessons do you hope they could take away from the book?
Yeah, so for me, I think a good, not just a book, but a good poem would be able to, you know, have a private conversation with whatever reader it is. Like, it's like this little universe that continues to stretch with meaning. I do not want to be the gatekeeper of that, but ultimately, for me, what I wanted to achieve is to, you know, like show the world the life of this person that I thought, you know, would have been a great woman in the world. When my child Bahara came into the world, a lot of things were unclear to me, but her presence just gave me a lot of clarity, and I wanted to document that experience so that, you know, like other people can have like a visceral interaction with that moment that otherwise they wouldn't be able to have. So this is like basically both the record of her being existing in the world and also the record of my experience with this amazing person that unfortunately the world wouldn't have the opportunity to meet except in the book.
Sure, yeah, immortalizes her. And I think, you know, a lot of people in times of stress turn to art and poetry maybe specifically, and so maybe they can find, you know, they feel like they're seen in their stories if they're similar to yours. So I think that's great. That's a great mindset to have. And I was wondering, you know, from an artistic standpoint, when you write, what kinds of techniques do you focus on or do you enjoy the most? Things like, you know, sound, rhythm, tone, metaphor. What of those techniques do you really hone in on when you write?
Yeah, so I found out that, you know, like my writing is very lyrical, which is a surprise because I do not consider myself a music person. But again, you know, like every language, even if it's a personal language, has its own lyricism. But I am more of an image person. I observe the world a lot, and I'm always reaching to try and transcribe reality onto images, onto language. So I used a lot of metaphors. Like all of these are just devices that I use to both see and also transcribe the things that I've seen into something that would give the reader a more emotional connection to it. So yeah, I am a poet that tries to draw pictures.
Sure, I love that description, and I definitely understand what you're saying. I think there's something to be said about the sound and rhythm of poetry. It keeps people reading it, but there's metaphor too, especially when you're dealing with emotions, any kind of emotions, grief to happiness. The metaphor is a way to express it in a new way that might connect with someone in a way it hasn't before. So I think their poetry has a lot of powerful tools for that. And so that's good. Hopefully people might see this and have that in mind when they go to read the work, and they can plug into it more. We've got a little bit of time left. I was hoping if you'd like, you could read one of the poems from the collection.
Yeah, I'd read a poem titled Interment, and it's a poem that speaks to the moment when the child passed and she's still being breastfed, what we went through in that moment. Interment. Your mother's breasts swell with milk. She cups each in her hands as she delicately squeezes the warm milk through puffed up nipples into a polythene bag. Paces into the yard, roots her knees to the earth, hands muddied as she digs the spot where she entombs the milk, there, in the place you used to play with your brother. She leans back, looks into an open sky, like one who has found a way of sending the milk across to you.
Wow, that's so great. It's a lot of specific details in there to plug in, and kind of has a haunting tone in a way. So thank you so much for reading that and for joining me today and talking about all of your work. So great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and this was an exciting conversation.
Good, sure, I enjoyed it too. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.